Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating, real-time geopolitical chess match that unfolded in early 2026. When a massive crisis erupted in the Middle East, the entire world watched to see exactly how the major global powers were going to react. And honestly, what we saw from Moscow and Beijing was a total masterclass in diplomatic posturing. On the surface, they presented this united front against the West. But if we look a little closer at the statements, the readouts, and the immediate actions on the ground, well, a completely distinct and profound divergence emerges. So today, we're mapping out exactly how, and more importantly why, Russia and China's responses to the Iran crisis fundamentally differed.
Okay, let's dive into this. We've got a lot of ground to cover.
A new Middle East crisis. To really understand the diplomacy here, we first have to understand the inciting incident that set off this whole global scramble. And man, the escalation happened with breathtaking speed. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched unauthorized military airstrikes on the territory of Iran. Then, the very next day, March 1st, Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the strikes. That was an event that sent absolute shockwaves through the international community. By March 2nd, the conflict had triggered a de facto blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which is literally one of the most vital shipping arteries on the planet. The sheer scale and speed of this conflict instantly forced the world's major powers to show their hands.
United against the U.S.
Before we get into how Moscow and Beijing diverged, we have to establish their shared baseline. In the immediate aftermath of the strikes, both Russia and China deployed identical framing. They both explicitly warned against a return to the law of the jungle. It's a phrase they both used. Both nations immediately utilized the crisis as a geopolitical tool to harshly critique the U.S.-led international order. Because the strikes completely bypassed the UN Security Council, Beijing and Moscow seized the opportunity to champion international law, accusing Washington and Tel Aviv of relying on unilateral military force and just trampling on the UN Charter. It was like this perfectly synchronized initial diplomatic volley.
And this brilliantly illustrates our core thesis today. Despite those shared platitudes about international law, their actual stakes in the region dictated wildly different diplomatic tones. When you compare them, it's striking. Russia's foreign policy is overwhelmingly focused on its war in Ukraine. Now, they do have deep historical ties to Iran, but importantly, they face very minimal economic risk in the Gulf. They essentially have nothing to lose by fanning the flames. China, on the other hand, they have massive, heavy investments across all the Gulf states. Their economy relies desperately on the Strait of Hormuz for energy imports. So for Beijing, strict regional stability isn't just a talking point. Actually, scratch that, it's a vital national security imperative.
Which brings us to Section 3, Russia's aggressive diplomatic stance.
Because they had such minimal economic risk in the immediate region, Moscow chose to turn the rhetoric all the way up. Listen to this quote from Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, because it perfectly captures Moscow's incandescent messaging. She stated, "The alleged Iranian threat was merely a pretext for implementing a plan to violently overthrow the constitutional order in a sovereign UN member state." Notice the complete lack of diplomatic hedging there. Russia wasn't just calling for peace, right? They were actively accusing the West of executing a premeditated, regime change agenda under the guise of security concerns. And this fiery rhetoric, it was absolutely systematic across the Russian government. They immediately labeled the strikes a deliberate, premeditated, and unprovoked act of armed aggression. They raised the stakes even further by warning the world of a potential radiological disaster because of strikes near nuclear facilities. President Vladimir Putin personally mourned Khamenei's death, calling it a cynical violation of all norms of human morality. And Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov went macro. He accused the United States of tearing up the post-World War II consensus and dragging the globe back into a 19th century world without international law. It was hard-hitting, it was aggressive, and it was clearly designed to isolate the U.S.
Now, let's shift gears to Section 4, China's pragmatic middle ground.
As we transition into Beijing's response, we see a completely different playbook in action. Just listen to the tone of Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. China calls for an immediate stop to the military actions, no further escalation of the tense situation, resumption of dialogue and negotiation, and efforts to uphold peace. If you juxtapose that incredibly measured, bureaucratic tone against Russia's firebrand accusations, it's night and day. China is condemning the actions for sure, but they are desperately trying not to alienate their Gulf partners. They're basically trying to extinguish the fire, not pour gasoline on it.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the reality behind that measured tone, which comes down to a single number. 3,000. That is the exact number of Chinese citizens that Beijing had to urgently evacuate from Iran by March 2nd. So, While Russia was out there issuing these fiery condemnations, China's diplomatic missions were literally working around the clock at border ports in neighboring countries. They were coordinating a massive, highly complex evacuation of their people. They needed stability, and they needed it right that second.
Because of this intense need for stability, Foreign Minister Wang Yi deployed a highly systematic, step-by-step approach to position China as the ultimate regional mediator. In nearly all his phone calls with regional leaders, he outlined 3 fundamental principles. Step 1, an immediate cessation of military operations. Step 2, a prompt return to dialogue and negotiations. And Step 3, joint opposition to unilateral actions. This is just classic Chinese diplomacy. It's structured, it's principled, and it's heavily focused on restoring the status quo so they can protect their economic footprint.
But internally, behind closed doors, China was definitely taking notes. An official military press account, the China Military Bugle, actually published what they called the 5 lessons from the U.S.-Israel strikes. They internalized the conflict, turning the whole crisis into a domestic learning opportunity about modern warfare. They noted the deadliest threat as the enemy within, the costliest miscalculation as a blind faith in peace. They starkly acknowledged the logic of superior firepower, and they ultimately concluded that their greatest reliance must be self-reliance. It's just a fascinating glimpse into how Beijing's military apparatus quietly and objectively analyzed the stark realities of the conflict.
All right, let's wrap up with Section 5, the global economic fallout. So, what does this all mean? Why does all this diplomatic posturing actually matter to you and me? Well, because the economic realities of this crisis threaten to impact absolutely everyone. Think about the number 14 million. 14 million. That is the staggering number of barrels of oil per day that typically travel through the Strait of Hormuz. When the conflict effectively closed down this critical transit route, a massive chunk of the world's seaborne oil exports was suddenly trapped.
So the crucial point is how that blocked strait translates directly to the market. Let's look at another number, $119. That was the terrifying spike in oil prices per barrel noted by Vladimir Putin himself during a meeting on the crisis. He pointed out the prices surged over 30% in just a week. The energy markets were utterly terrified, and the cost of this geopolitical instability was instantly and painfully priced into the global economy.
And the ripple effects here are profound. This de facto blockade halted roughly 1/5 of global oil and LNG supplies. I mean, we saw widespread disruptions of commercial logistics and international air travel. This inevitably leads to a heightened risk of severe global inflation. That means everything from your everyday groceries to your winter heating bill feels the impact as production chains break down and the cost of moving goods just skyrockets. It also triggered an intense, panicked competition among nations trying to secure reliable, long-term energy contracts outside the Middle East.
The major powers are acutely aware of this economic fragility. As Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi stated, it's impossible to channel the vast ocean of the global economy back into isolated lakes. It runs counter to the tide of history. He basically framed the economic disruption as a direct, painful consequence of straying from global cooperation and prioritizing unilateral military force over dialogue.
And that leaves us with a really critical question to consider. As Russia aggressively fuels the fire to isolate the West and China pragmatically attempts to guard its investments and to play the mediator, what does this unified but distinctly divided Sino-Russian posturing actually mean for the future of the U.S.-led global order? Thank you so much for joining this explainer. Keep questioning the geopolitical narratives around you, look closely at who really has what at stake, and we will see you next time.